Welcome to Eyes on Privacy, episode number 25. This week I'm joined again by Keith Watson, and I'm Preston Wiley, and we're going to be talking about a few privacy-related articles for you again this week. The first one comes from the Associated Press. It has to do with basically supposedly anonymized data, and an MIT study basically took anonymized credit card data from 1.1 million people, and using some information from 10,000 shops, they were able to essentially calculate that they'd only need, on average, 4 pieces of data to de-anonymize to basically figure out who a person is, and if a price was included, they'd only need 3 pieces of data to de-anonymize somebody from this supposedly anonymous list. And I mean, this leads to a lot of questions on essentially the privacy of other. I mean, I'd say even Microsoft and a lot of things say, oh, you know, when you use this app, do you want to send anonymous data to wherever, to Google, to Microsoft, to whoever, to do for, you know, research purposes or whatever. And I think this study kind of brings the question of whether you should check that checkbox. I personally usually don't check the box. I usually turn it off. But I mean, when you say, "Oh, we're sending the data anonymously," anonymous doesn't necessarily guarantee privacy. I don't think those two are necessarily synonymous. So I think this is an interesting study. And what do you think about it, Keith?
Well, I think this is another case where the application of taking large amounts of data, even if it is anonymous, and doing some statistical analysis on it yields significant amounts of data about what people assumed was private. And we've seen this before in other cases as well. One of the projects I dealt with a couple years ago was anonymizing data for a particular disease that people had, and even just having dates of when it was diagnosed and when it was treated, and the name of the hospital obviously was more than enough, given the rarity of this particular disease, to track it back to who the original person was. And so this is another case where they've taken plenty of what is seemingly, you know, anonymous data and been able to track it back to one person. I think there was a study probably 10 years ago, probably more than 10 years ago now that I think about it, where AOL released search terms for anonymized users. And so they assigned an anonymous ID to each person's search term, and a reporter who was fairly smart enough was able to track back to one person based on just the search terms they were entering into their browser through AOL. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we assume there's a lot of anonymous data that can't be traced back to us, but the more we have available the more that's collected, I should say, the more that these data scientists and statisticians can go back through and track it back to us. And so, yeah, this anonymous data doesn't provide us the privacy perhaps that we thought it did. So it'll be interesting to see what other studies can find in terms of anonymous data and its failures, and then what do we do about it? I mean, is there another way to look at it, or do we have to release even less data to, you know, trick the people who are trying to de-anonymize data? I don't know.
Now, would you advise people to check do you think there's any value to this versus the checking and unchecking that box about sending anonymous data to a company for you know, to check to, you know, improve the quality of their application?
I think we can assume that what can we assume? I think we can assume that that data can be traced back to us, but given the app we're using, that might be okay, depending on what it is. So for example, if you were playing a game, maybe not a big deal, but if you're sending back data from your web browser, might be. I don't know. It kind of depends on what data is actually sent back to, whether that, like on the Firefox browser that has a telemetry thing, which returns information about how the software is performing and some other information like that. But if it actually returned URLs that you were browsing, yeah, that would be a big problem. I never really looked into that one in terms of what it returns. I think it's more about the operational aspects of the browser, but I don't know. I've not actually seen the data sent, so it's hard to say. Probably want to uncheck that thing.
Yeah, I usually uncheck it. So I mean, but I think the data that the app is dealing with, I think would be a big factor in whether you'd want to check that. Like if you're playing Angry Birds or something like that, there's not really going to be any personal data that's going to be sent back and forth. It's usually like, the app crashed or whatever.
Well, that, or they might know how long you've been playing it.
Right.
That might if you saw that information yourself, you might go, maybe I shouldn't be playing this game so much. I can do another thing worthwhile.
Right. Well, the next story we have is about the ACLU apparently was able to get their hands on some information on a tracking program that the DEA has been using to track to scan and store hundreds of millions of motorist records for use in seizing drugs and assets and things like that. But they've allowed other law enforcement agencies to use this database as well. And the ACLU, I think, has a lot of questions on this program because they say, well, there's no court oversight of this data, and it's being used for purposes outside of its original intent, and various things like that. And this is a privacy concern. Basically, it's pretty much a large-scale tracking program, like a lot of other things that we've seen recently as far as stuff like this goes. So I think this is an interesting program, and I don't know what kind of reaction to have to it just immediately. What do you think? Should we be outraged?
I think we should be concerned, certainly. I know that there are some law enforcement police officers that have license plate scanners attached to their car, so as they drive down the street, it's reading all the license plates of all the cars that it's passing. So cars parked along the street, it's able to detect the license plate and then note where the car was, using GPS and a timestamp, so they know where cars were at any particular time. And I thought that was a pretty invasive sort of program. This is no better than that. I think in many cases it might be worse because it's multi-state and it can be used by other law enforcement and other government agencies to do queries. And in fact, if you look at the ACLU's heavily redacted document that they provided, it says cleared personnel from other federal agencies as well as state and local agencies have the ability to conduct queries in the LPR database via Epic. So that tells you what you need to know right there. This is information available to any agency, state and local, as well as federal. So I'm sure they're tapping into this database all the time and watching where people are going. And then the question is, well, is that unreasonable search? I don't know. Certainly I don't think the courts have weighed in here yet. on whether this is or not. So it's very interesting. And they do have it, according to this, deployed at least in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, Georgia, and New Jersey. I'm not sure why New Jersey. All these others are fairly southern states, and then there's New Jersey, of course. So it's always New Jersey. Why is that? Anyways, yes, I would be concerned about this, certainly. Actually, I'd be concerned about any program that is tracking cars and then making that information available to any law enforcement system.
Well, yeah, and there's one other thing is the supposedly this information is stored up to 6 months. So, in fact, records on cars that don't generate a hit are said to be stored for 6 months, which the ACLU says that's way too long to store this information.
And, the other concern is if you drive up. So, for example, if you drive up through Chicago and you go on any of the toll roads, there are plenty of license plate readers on that, mostly because they're providing service to drivers, right? So you're paying the toll. You use your iPass to scan through the toll booth, but it's still reading your license plate in many cases as you're going through. Depends on where you are, but so I've always wondered about who has access to that data as well. I know that in several, I believe it's been a couple divorce cases where the one spouse wanted to prove the unfaithfulness of another spouse would actually subpoena records from the toll booth operator just so they could find out where the car was, so they could help make the case that this spouse was being unfaithful. So certainly that information is collected, and without any tighter controls and perhaps subpoenas from judicial branches, I don't know if this information should be as easily accessible as it is, despite the fact that it says cleared personnel from federal and state and local agencies have access to it. So
yeah, it certainly raises a lot of questions. But so the third article we have is kind of the polar opposite of that. Is that the Google Waze app is basically a kind of a mapping. It's a mapping app that also allows users to kind of contribute to the application. They can essentially say, "Oh, the traffic's bad here" or whatever. But there's one feature that they can do is alert, essentially say there's a police officer in this location. And police are concerned about being tracked, essentially, because they claim that it could present a risk to them because, if somebody decided they wanted to take action against a police officer, they could go into the app and say, oh, there's a police officer here, and essentially be able to find a police officer that if they wanted to do some sort of nasty thing.
True, but the problem with this one is Waze is really kind of this data gathering app. So as you're driving in your car, it tracks how fast you're going, and so it can detect where you are and how fast you're going. So if you suddenly slow down, and a bunch of other users are slowing down, that indicates, the traffic's pretty slow here. And then you can also report in, like, the reason it slows is because there's an accident here, or there's road construction here, and another one is just there's a police officer here. It might be a speed trap or something like that. So from a driver perspective, Waze is just submitting data which is then used by other drivers to get alerts and say, hey, there's a slow traffic up ahead, and you might want to take a different route. So to make the leap from this is a traffic monitoring app to this is a hunt the police officer down app is a big stretch for me. I don't see it. If users of Waze are really looking to find out what the traffic is in their situation, so those with long commutes can avoid some of the heavier traffic areas. And even if it does say, hey, there's a police officer there, they're probably on a freeway or they're on a highway. I don't know that you're going to have crazy killers out there hunting down the police on a freeway or a highway. It seems a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, so I've had a few interactions with the app. I don't use it on a regular basis or anything like that, but the accuracy of it is not, 100%. So, if you see information on it, you're getting potentially out of date information, and or somebody hit the wrong button or whatever. So I've seen the app in action, and it was okay. It wasn't the most accurate thing.
Well, around here in our location, I don't think we probably have a lot of Waze users. And when you don't have a lot of users, you can have sketchy data.
Yeah, I mean, I saw it being used in Chicago and Indianapolis. Sure. So, two big places, two big areas, and the data was okay. I mean, it wasn't. It was. I didn't consider it more useful than like just the straight up Google, the Google Maps that you get, because it has traffic on it as well. So
right. It pulls a lot of data from road sensors by whatever Department of Transportation, right? So it's getting some data from the streets themselves, whereas this is trying to track users as they travel. And since Google owns them, they're kind of merging that data in, I assume, into the mapping app. But regardless, going back to the issue, I think this is the National Sheriff's Association and one guy thinking, well, this is just terrible. We're going to have cops killed all the time because of one app, and people reporting that there's a police officer on a highway or freeway. I don't buy it.
Right. The interesting thing about the article, I think the most interesting thing about the article is the title of the article is NSA gunning for Google, and then the right under that it says not that NSA, the other one.
Exactly.
The NSA they're talking about is the National Sheriff's Association.
Exactly. That's a bit misleading. It's a good headline to to get the clicks, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So I mean I think it's somewhat I mean, the previous article we talked about was basically a police agency tracking people, like large-scale tracking of people, and this is, kind of the other side of the coin where people are tracking law enforcement, essentially.
Well, that's the conclusion they're trying to bring about, but right. I find it a bit of a stretch.
Right, and this whole alerting people that police are ahead thing is not a new concept either. It's been going on for as long as people have been able to flash their headlights or
exactly
whatever.
I was going to mention that. That's usually how you find out about it. Somebody coming at you flashing their headlights.
Yeah.
Thanks. There's a cop ahead.
Yeah. So this whole alerting people is not a new thing, and it hasn't. As far as I know, it hasn't. There's been no issues with that method of alerting people, so I don't see this one as being any much different. The information would it change quickly, and information from 5 minutes ago would probably be of no use.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, that's our 3 articles for this week. Do we have any closing statements to make?
No, I mean, we talked a little bit about anonymous data and apps that are asking for anonymous data. We might just want to not give it to them anymore.
Yeah, uncheck that box, because sometimes it's automatically checked and you just want to uncheck it. Yeah.
And maybe your Waze app too might want to just delete that because it's also sending anonymous data.
Yeah, and I think there's and Google. I mean, there's a checkbox. There's a checkbox within, I think, like an Android device, and it's just one, like, send data to Google. Might want to uncheck.
Oh, well, yeah. If you want to talk about that tracking, and I used it for a while, it keeps a history of where you go with your device, and it's pretty accurate if you want to keep that.
Yeah.
They claim you're the only one looking at it. Well, okay, sure. But yeah, I turned that off. No more location tracking and location history for me. But then we're also on Google Plus Hangouts, so I'm sure they're all, gathering tons of data from us too. So,
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
but I
I'm
don't
sure
know.
of it. Everyone collects that data on everybody. That's on the internet, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
So, all right. Well, with that, thank you to Keith Watson. I'm Preston Wiley, and keep your eyes on privacy.